What's going on, everybody? My name is Michael Levan, and thank you so much for joining us today for this GigaOm webinar with xMatters. Paul, how's it going, man? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Doing excellent. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation here.
Absolutely, 100%. This is obviously one of my my favorite topics, both as an analyst and as a principal consultant in the SRE and the DevOps space. Obviously, incident response, reliability, performance, all of these things are super ridiculously crucial with everything that I do pretty much daily. So I'm definitely excited to be able to talk about all this stuff today, especially with xMatters. So today, as you guys can see, reliability through automation for your infrastructure and applications at scale. That's really what we're going to be focusing on. So I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Michael Levan. I'm an analyst here at GigaOm, and I'm also a principal SRE consultant, blogger, public speaker, et cetera, et cetera. Paul, I'll let you go ahead and do a little brief intro of yourself as well.
Yeah, and Paul Porter, of course, and I manage the pre-sales or sales engineering team here at xMatters, which is a global group of people that provide technical sales to all of our clients. And of course, we're also now part of a larger organization called Everbridge, which has also a terrific global footprint. So we have a lot of terrific experience with clients all around the world.
That's awesome. Yeah, and for everybody that's listening, if you're not familiar with the sales engineering role, it's actually quite unique, and I think it's going to make it for an interesting conversation here, because I remember I've spoken to several sales engineers, and I never really understood the role a while back, and then I remember I was talking to somebody at Cisco Meraki years ago, and this guy was like probably one of the best network engineers I've ever spoken to, from like a Cisco and a Juniper perspective and all that stuff. And the one thing that actually I started to understand was, sales engineering are people that are engineers at heart, really love the technology, but also love to be able to teach and show people exactly what's happening, which is, of course, awesome for a webinar and for any type of speaking. So we have the right guy here, Paul, to be able to tell us what exactly is happening with xMatters and all that good stuff for anybody who's interested in the product. All right, so agenda. We're going to be talking about incident response in this technology world that we live in today, which is vastly different year by year, especially from 5 years ago. Everything's very different now. We're going to be talking about alerting and communication, automation and experimenting. We're going to be talking about the scenario-based test examples that we did for this benchmark. We're going to be talking about the results of the testing, and then we're going to be talking about best practices. So we're definitely going to be diving into the benchmark and the results, but we're also going to be talking about, what we're seeing day to day and how automated incident response can, actually help you in your day to day and make your life much easier. All right, so let's get started, Paul. Incident response in a hybrid world. I mean, this is something that I'm super passionate about, and I'm really interested in, because we lived in a world for a long time where we had these run books, and these run books essentially are really in-depth step-by-step instructions on how to fix an issue. It should really almost be like, here's the run book. Anybody could just go through these steps, whether it's somebody in desktop support, somebody in systems administration, a developer, a DevOps engineer, an SRE. Like, anybody can go through this. But that's great and all, but obviously it's a very manual step to be able to get all these things done, especially at 2 a.m. Right? So
Yeah.
automated incident response. I mean, that's obviously a huge thing. Is that kind of what you're seeing as well? Like, are people just diving all over this because we finally have a product to be able to do this type of thing?
Absolutely. I think one of the great shifts, it wasn't overnight, it's been a slow transition, but as it highlights in the slide even here, is that we're not just in a data center anymore that's solely owned by the client. A lot of organizations are multi-cloud as well as premise-based, and then they've got all those things integrated together. So what used to be a fairly straightforward sort of run book, a series of steps that you could execute, now spans all these different environments. And of course, the complexity of the applications has really gone up. So the challenge for not only to understand all those environments, but to be able to execute that quickly, of course, because now your applications are so much more visible than they used to be. is really changed, or raised the bar in terms of what we need.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you're absolutely right. Like I feel like cloud and hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, like it's definitely opened up the doors to make things easier for us. But at the same time, it's definitely made things harder, especially from an incident response perspective. I mean, because at the end of the day, there are some things that are in your control and some things that maybe aren't. Like if a region goes down in a cloud, it's kind of out of your control. You got to hope that you have the auto scaling set up. You gotta hope that you have multi-region set up, multi-VPC set up, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's definitely made it more difficult from that perspective. And because of that, having the ability to get some automated incident response in there, get the visibility in there, get the automation in there, like it is becoming crucial. I mean, it's almost, I'd argue, it's no longer an option.
Yeah, I think you're right. And part of what follows into that is the whole idea that, we're delivering updates, faster, or, you know, oftentimes organizations are measuring it in terms of their velocity of their CI/CD pipeline. But however you look at it, the expectation of incident response being equally fast is right in there. And no one actually went out and specifically defined a lot of the incident response and how to make it faster. But as organization, we saw that as one of those critical needs that over the years wasn't really addressed the same way that it was from an engineering perspective. DevOps started a long time ago, but incident, ITIL never catch up with a lot of the ideas of automation that we saw from a DevOps or an engineering perspective. So it has become more critically important as more and more organizations, even if it's only part of an organization, has adopted this faster release cadence.
Yeah, no, 100%. And with that automation, comes automated runbooks, or as xMatters calls them, their workflows, which we'll obviously talk about here and coming up shortly. But yeah, I mean, all that stuff and being able to combine that with everything that's going on in the world today from a technology standpoint and how fast everything is moving, it's obviously very crucial. Okay, so some considerations here. Number one, you absolutely need hybrid alerting. I mean, let's say you're using xMatters for incident response. You need to have the ability to alert for AWS, alert for Azure, alert for something on-prem, alert for your virtualized environment, alert for applications that are going down. Because it's not just systems anymore; it's the application performance as well. Communication is obviously a huge part here. There's no I in team, as we all know, and
Right.
having the ability to be able to talk to people, to be able to communicate, to be able to escalate. Depending on the team, depending on the application that's down, depending on the system that's down, communication is a huge part of this. Yeah, at the end of the day, technology doesn't, in my opinion, technology doesn't solve the problem. We've had the technology. It's really more about taking the technology and using it in the right way, and that comes with teams, that comes with communication. And then we have automation. So of course automation takes over the world. It's all about repeatability at this point. We don't want to just automate something just to automate it, but we do want that continuous repeatability. And then of course the experimentation. Things are moving fast, more rapidly than ever before. I tell everybody, you got to keep yourself up to date every 3 to 6 months now versus a couple of years ago you could say keeping yourself up to date every 2 to 5 years. And to be able to do that, you have to experiment, you have to be able to play around, you have to be able to work with all these different technologies and these tools to see that what works for you. So in this whole hybrid learning, communication, automation, experimentation, what are you kind of seeing from an xMatter standpoint, and where can it really shine here?
Yeah, I think it also this really maps to the different organizations, different clients that we work with, and where they are in the maturity of adopting, either different methodologies or also potentially uh, different tools and solutions. I mean, hopefully it's in the realm of a methodology, whether you're going to call it DevOps or it's the Google SRE model. That becomes a great framework for why people should or need to actually change their incident response. But I really like, the way the Google SRE model thinks about it, because not only do you take from DevOps, if you build it, you own it, or you run it, so you're responsible for being on call, as it were. But the idea in that model that you don't want to just spend all your time responding to incidents and fixing problems. You should be
Sure.
automating more of that incident response, 50% or more of your time in that. And so we actually see clients really starting to embrace that. I wouldn't say that clients are wholesale, we need to be Google SRE, aligned sort of stuff, because it's not practical for them, because they don't have that same architecture environment. They've got 20-year-old systems that they're dealing with.
Sure.
But where they can, being able to make sure that more of those incident response processes, it might be, simple things like performing some automated triage before notifying somebody, or even potentially trying to automate the remediation before you notify someone. That becomes really powerful.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's definitely what we saw throughout the tests here as well. When we were looking at, integrations, flexibility of roles and permissions, ease of setting it up, when it comes to communicating with different teams, when it comes to escalations and all that stuff. I mean, I definitely think that xMatters obviously shines in a bunch of places, but this was definitely a really solid place that I enjoyed from a, shining standpoint when I was going through these benchmarks. One of the things that definitely stood out to me was the simple fact that xMatters has this 100% free option that includes 10 users. So even if if you have a small team and you want to get started, you're a startup, you're just building an MVP, and you want to be able to do things the right way from a communication standpoint and from an alerting standpoint, you could get 10 people on board right away. You have your SSO set up, no maintenance windows, all of that good stuff. So you right out of the box, you have the ability to set up that communication aspect of things. And that's definitely what we saw when we were going through the benchmarks. Another huge thing that I want to point out too is the flexibility of the roles and the permissions that we saw. You can obviously get very granular in xMatters, which is great. And I think that that's super important from a, not only in an automation perspective, but also from a communication perspective, because at the end of the day, typically, depending on the environment, you do have like owners of specific systems or specific applications or specific services, and the ability to set up those roles, those permissions, to be able to modify the rules, who's getting notifications, what policies these users have, what roles they have, the on-call shifts, even, like who's getting the escalation point here, who's getting alerted for what. It's obviously a huge thing, and that was one of the biggest aspects that I did want to point out with xMatters was that ability is there. And not only is it there, but for your small team, it's there for free, which is obviously, nobody could pass up free, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That's really brings, all the capabilities and makes them much more accessible to smaller organizations, as well as larger organizations that just want to try out some new things. And with the free product, one of the keys that we really wanted to drive there is to really share those ideas about the fact that automation should be part of incident response, not just notification, not just, getting text messages or voice calls or push messages or emails out to folks, whatever it might be, but really to make sure that people could appreciate where they can go from a vision or a maturity perspective. And, within the product, from the schedules and rotations and shifts and and then down to the roles and permissions of that, we have and continue to drive more robustness into the product. I think really the focus that we've had over last number of years has been to try and make that just dead easy to use, because if I look back 5-6 years ago, we had a lot of functionality, but it wasn't always easy to use or accessible. And so making that first use, kind of getting to the product quickly and allowing some default settings just to kick in to make it fast and easy to get up and running becomes an important part of the platform too.
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's something really huge that I do want to dive into a little bit as well. And again, I think it's, all throughout this session today, but the ability to get an alert, like that's obviously crucial. You need to understand if a system is down, if it didn't scale the way that you were expecting it to, the application isn't performing the way that you're expecting it to. But at the end of the day, like that's half the battle, right? Like the other half is what do you do with this now? What can I do with this alert? And the ability to actually do something with it and not just get the alert for it. It's obviously a huge game changer for
Yeah.
both, scaling and for the engineer that doesn't want to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I know I certainly don't. And this, obviously because of that, it spans even greater than just the technical aspect, right? Like it makes your engineers happier
Yeah,
because they know,
absolutely.
like, exactly, like, because they know, like, let's say you're on call. I mean, I've been in organizations where I was on call 14 days out of the month. And that's obviously hectic, especially if you have a life, which all of us do in one way
Yeah,
or another.
kind of limiting
So,
there.
exactly. So, because you have this automated incident response set up, you can give your engineers a better quality of life, and therefore they're going to stay with you longer. And so there's the people aspect of this, and there's also the technical aspect, and both are very important.
Yeah, I would agree. I think many of those key ideas about, just notifying someone is considered incident response
Mhm.
is a very limiting view and really incorrect because you have to consider the whole incident process.
Right.
And with that, there's so many more steps from the triage or expanded engagement or letting business owners know about the problem or clients or, you know, greater people outside of that. So really automating more of that to reduce the toil, all those little bitty steps that slow you down, like just automate as much of that so that you can really orchestrate the greater process that really brings a business focus to what you're doing in incident response. Like, no doubt there's, technical bits and details that we are focused on, but we also, have to do it under the umbrella of the fact that we're supporting a business function.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so testing xMatters. This is the nuts and bolts of it all. This is why we're all here. What kind of happened when we were going through the testing? Well, we saw a lot of really awesome things. Number one, the product setup was extremely straightforward. I mean, it is a SaaS platform, so you don't have to worry about running this yourself. In terms of xMatters, when I say this, you don't have to worry about running xMatters yourself. The permissions, really straightforward, honestly. I was creating different test users, I was creating groups, I was tying those groups to services, and it was very straightforward. The UI is definitely one of my favorites, I would say, in this realm. I really enjoyed it, honestly. It was very easy to set up a service, to go in, add a service, get that service in there, put an owner on it if I needed to, get active incidents tied to it from a users and a group's perspective. That was all very straightforward to set up. The workflow design across cloud providers and collaboration, yeah, we were testing through Azure, we were testing through AWS, we were connecting workflows with Azure Monitor, we were getting the integration set up for CloudWatch for AWS. And the one thing that I want to point out here is I really enjoyed the documentation. Like, I feel like documentation is so crucial for somebody that's not only new to the product, but maybe new to the space. Maybe you have a new SRE and they're trying to figure out what automated incident response is going to look like and what this collaboration is going to look like through these hybrid models that we have today. And it was the documentation was really solid. What I really liked about it, and this was something that stuck out to me, when you're setting up an integration, there's like, you have the integration, or let's say you're setting up AWS CloudWatch, you have the integration, you have the install, you can set it up, but on the same page, there's also the link to take you to the documentation. Like you don't have to go and look for it. It's there for you, which is a basic feature, but so helpful. And not everybody's doing that. And
Yeah.
that was really, really awesome to see.
Yeah, you would think it's one of those intuitive things, but our docs team has definitely done an awesome job of really putting together uh, the solution so that it does become kind of a self-service environment almost, so that you can start building and jumping into it and find the right assets at the right time
Mhm.
in order to keep you moving along from a development perspective and building out your workflows. No doubt, there's a formal official training. There's recorded trainings and all those sorts of things. But it turns out that in the world we live in, a lot of people don't go dedicate time for that. They just kind of want to jump in and start learning right away.
Yep, exactly, 100%. So, diving into this topic a little bit deeper, the setup, very straightforward. Like I said, I mean, not only do you have the platform up and running for you from a SaaS standpoint, but the workflow templates, the integrations, everything's pretty much set up there for you. The documentation is there for you. Very straightforward in terms of step by step. That's at least, what I found. Flexibility of roles and permissions. Again, you have users. You can get extremely granular with these users. When you go and you click add a user, at that point, you have these roles set up, and these roles are, again, very granular. Like, you have anything from the company supervisor to the developer to the full access user. You have no access user, so you have that read only aspect of things. You even have like REST web service user. I mean, there's if security is in the forefront of your mind in terms of a tool like this, and what user has access to what from this incident response perspective, which could be pretty important, especially from an automation standpoint. You don't want just anybody to be able to go click a workflow automation and who knows what can happen. So if you want to be able to think about it from a security standpoint of who's going to have access to what, it definitely gets very granular setting that up, which is awesome. And then from a group's perspective, when you go in, you can add a new group, you can add users to that group, and the permissions typically fall under the user profile itself. But the one thing that I liked about the group is having the ability to add that to the service. So, like, let's say you have, a service like, I don't know, EC2 instances that you want to be able to monitor. At that point, you go and you find your group, you add that group to the service, and then whoever's in that group is able to manage it with their proper permissions and stuff. So when you think about, from a users and from a group perspective, do you find that type of feature very important to your clients and your customers to be able to get that granular?
Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of organizations, especially DevOps style organizations, where if it's a small company, they tend to have a group of teams and they all collaborate very well together. In larger companies, as that adoption begins to happen, they're very protective about their assets and the things that they built. And so permissions becomes really important so that you can actually control who has access to, all the different integrations and the workflows that are set up. And there's, in some cases, there are some standardization that, people want to share assets, but in other cases, it's like they have a certain process that they want to drive, and, they don't want just anybody going in and updating or creating versions of their integrations or steps within workflows. And so that becomes really important. And at first glance, it probably is not so obvious that that's a key. If I'm just an individual or just a team going in, everybody's kind of on the same page. But certainly as you scale, that becomes as important as your source code management and who you have access to whatever that's out there. So I think that's really key. And then you also pointed out this notion of groups and services from an alignment and an ownership perspective. And that's also incredibly powerful. I think, one of the important things that we continue to straddle, are these hybrid environments where we've got monolithic or, premise or older applications, and then we've got the newer microservice architectures that we love because it's got that, just dead on service alignment. And so from a monitoring management perspective, it's much easier. It's more granular at the same time, but making sure that you can address both those models, because not everything is, truly going to be a service or a business service. We would love for it to be, but we still have to be able to support all different sort of angles for large customers, large environments that are still in transition.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more there. And, having the ability to support those large organizations and the small organizations, I think that's really where one of my favorite topics, automated runbooks, or as xMatters calls them, workflows. I think that, this is definitely one of my favorites in terms of having the ability to set up that automated incident response. So, with automated runbooks, I mean, was that a service that was just on by default with xMatters, or did xMatters kind of start as like the standard incident response and then built automated runbooks or workflows inside of the product?
We've actually had an ability to define a process that you would execute um, for many years in the product. It used to be something called Integration Builder, although it was really a code level sort of solution that you needed to jump to.
Sure.
And so a number of years ago, we converted, and switched to a true workflow designer, drag and drop, where you can actually build out that workflow. And it really brought the power of being able to, create your own run book or define your own process flow, to a lot more people. You don't have to be a developer, necessarily to go in and build these workflows, because it literally is codeless for a lot of the environments and a lot of the examples that people want to go through. You still have the depth there where you can go create a custom step for your workflow, where you can go write some code, or you can be executing code in cloud or premise, in order to make sure you've got all the right steps driven. Or, you could literally call Ansible or Chef or Puppet or Jenkins, to execute other code elsewhere. But making it accessible, and also from a visibility perspective, literally you can look at the workflow. It's like looking at a picture, and you can understand the steps and what's happening within it, and that becomes powerful too, because all this isn't staying the same for a year or multiple years. It's all going to change. It's just a question of how soon you're going to have to adapt it to either different processes, different environments, or different applications and services that you build.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. And something that I'd like to touch on there as well, which I think is super important and crucial, is we're definitely moving towards a world where the way that I say it is, everybody's a developer in one way or another. That doesn't mean that you're writing, the next Twitter or Instagram or something, but what it does mean is, you're typically doing something with code. You're doing some type of automation, infrastructure automation, et cetera. There's always something going on. So one of the things that I really liked about automated runbooks was, I was testing out different types of scripts for coded automation. So Python, Ansible, PowerShell, Bash commands, which was really awesome. xMatters has JavaScript integration for automation code in the workflows. And you also have the UI stuff. So if you're a developer, in an SRE where you come from a development background, you can go in and you can automate these workflows, from a coding standpoint. But if you're a systems administrator and you're like, I just want to be able to run some Ansible code for some configuration management for these workflows, but I want to be able to set up the workflow from a UI perspective, you could do that too. Like, it's kind of like you have the best of both worlds depending on which scenario you want to go with.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. The flexibility is just amazing, and being able to drive it at whatever level you want, and then potentially collaborate with other people. It could be that, it's someone defining the basic flow, but then they leverage other resources to drill down for custom steps, or,
Right.
some of those scripts that need to be written.
Yep. Absolutely, absolutely. It's definitely the best of both worlds, which is obviously a phenomenal thing, especially for, the versatile engineer that does a little bit of coding, that also likes the UI, all that good stuff. So when we're thinking about the general workflow of, say, an incident, something happened in a system, or an application. We'll take a system because I think it's an easier example. You got an EC2 instance and it's running an application, and all of a sudden you find out that there's, some sort of memory leak there. At that point you hope, you get a ticket initiated, the incident shows up, it goes to it's tied to a specific service, the user or the group gets alerted. And one of the things that I was testing, for example, if you create a workflow for, say, Azure Monitor, an incident can be triggered with when that workflow, or I'm sorry, when the incident kicks off, the workflow can be triggered. So, let's say again, you got some system, maybe it needs to be restarted or something like that. Well, Azure Monitor is monitoring that system. The workflow then gets the workflow essentially gets an alert and it says, "Oh, I need to kick this off," and then maybe the system goes and restarts, or something occurs, maybe some auto scaling happens, whatever the case may be on the back end. But the really cool thing from, again, an incident response perspective, initiating that ticket is once you kind of configure the recipients for a specific incident happening on a specific service, for example, you can have your specific team, you can have a specific person get notified by that incident. And then at that point, it gets escalated, it can go to different teams, et cetera, et cetera. Um, how do you feel about that? I mean, how do you feel about, all of the different integrations from an incident perspective? I mean, do you have a specific, favorite type of incident alert response, in terms of the workflow, or how you're seeing clients and customers kind of setting up these style workflows when it comes to incidents?
Yeah, this is a really important area because incident management has gotten really complex with a lot of solutions out there. I mean,
Mm.
everybody can think of the large uh, incident platform, ITSM platform that they have to deal with,
Mm.
and a lot of that complexity slows people down in reality. And so the incident within xMatters that we create, we want to do it just as you're describing. It's like we want it to automatically be created for us. And as we're notifying people, or groups, we want that to automatically be captured as well and just added to the incident. So we're really building this audit trail automatically into the incident just as part of the workflow that we've defined. And when that signal comes in from a monitoring solution, from Azure Monitor, wherever it might be, and it tells us that we have a particular problem, if it's aligned to a service, then it can automatically map to that service owner or that group. And so you've got that automatic flow, and that contextual information just also flows into the incident. And if you're in xMatters looking at the incident, again, we want it to be dead easy to expand your engagement. So literally just clicking a couple buttons and say, hey, I need this additional team. I need this front end team or back end team or this additional service team that we're dependent on to engage them quickly. And it just becomes part of the audit trail so that from a postmortem perspective, you have that audit trail. So being able to tie all these things together in an automated way, again, it goes back to that notion of reducing toil. So like, yeah, people can, document these things or cut and paste them into different environments, but why should we when we can actually just automate it? Like, let people focus on the hard work, the creative work of solving problems.
Yep. No, exactly, 100%. And I feel like I'm going to bring this up again at some point in this webinar, but it goes back to actually what we were talking about yesterday with the SRE handbook, where 50% of your time should go to putting out a fire, but the other 50% of the time should go to figuring out why that fire occurred and then fixing it. And that's obviously, once you find that fix, oh, the fix is, I got to restart this service, or oh, the fix is I got to be able to, scale this cluster out. You can then automate that and you could put that into a workflow, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's definitely the beautiful thing there. Another thing too that I want to point out that I really enjoyed was, let's say you have an incident and it's like low, medium, high, etc. Any of the workflows that are running for that incident, you have the ability to not only get the alert about it and not only have the automated fix for it, but you also have the ability to tell people what's going on in their preferred method of communication. So you can add, for any incident, you can add Slack in their Teams, the xMatters conference bridge. You can essentially set up, whatever's easier for users or engineers to be able to see what's happening. So for me, for example, I I'm personally the type of person where I have my phone in another room for several hours in the morning. I'm not really checking email or anything like that because I don't like distractions. But I will open Slack up every once in a while just to make sure that there's nothing crazy going on. So if I'm that person, well, maybe I open up Slack and then I'm like, oh, this is happening. Let me see if anybody needs help here. Versus if it just goes to an email or a phone, I probably won't see it for the first 3, 4 hours of my day. So it's really awesome from, an incident, I'll call it incident management perspective, to be able to get that messaging on the different platforms, or from the different platforms rather.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, is that, oftentimes we think of communications as that direct, to, the cell phone with a SMS or a voice call or something. And in reality, that doesn't fit every model.
Mhm.
I think that's, I think it's important, but I think it's also a way that, we've just been doing it for a lot of years. But a lot of teams want this additional flexibility. In fact, I've encountered a number of DevOps teams where they're focused on Slack more than, and they have Slack on their phone. So it's still mobile and it gets them in the right place, but it's not necessarily the traditional ways that we've thought of. And I think you're exactly on target there. That SRE notion of automating more of the response. In fact, the xMatters, our SaaS solution, runs in the cloud, and it is a microservice architecture itself. And we automatically restart services that are having issues themselves. Of course, we're scaled horizontally, so it's not like you're restarting everything all at once, but you can do that cascading restart. And that's what we do before we notify anyone. And if the service comes back, back to normal and is operating well, then we're just posting an update into Slack to let people know that we did restart the service. I've seen some clients where they want to, create a backlog item in Jira. It's like, that's just another part of the workflow. It can, automatically restart the service and then post those updates to the right places so that we don't interrupt people in their critical work and their critical thought. Because you've probably also seen, like, I think your approach is great, like kind of lock down, your work time. Because if you get interrupted, it's something like 15 or 20 minutes before you can get back into the groove.
Yep.
And so making sure that we're only interrupting people at the right place becomes even more important.
Yeah, no, it's actually funny that you bring that up. I feel like our mindsets are very similar. I'm a big psychology buff, and that whole notion of like it takes us X amount of time. It's actually 23 minutes. So when we're like distracted or something pops up, it takes us an average of 23 minutes to get back fully 100% to what we were doing, and that's
Wow,
kind of crazy, right?
yeah,
So
that's what I can say.
so having the ability to like send that message to people, like even an informational, like if it's a low incident, like, and you have 12 hours to fix it, like you don't need to get a phone call for that. You don't need to get a text message for that. You probably don't need to get an email for that. You probably just need to get it, in some type of Slack channel. And whether you're let's say you're a global organization, like maybe the next people that are, working at 9 a.m. when you're sleeping at 9 p.m. Maybe those are the people that pick it up. And that's why I think the messaging is so absolutely crucial there. So speaking of being efficient, one of the biggest things is reports. You need to actually understand what's happening, and not, maybe not the engineer, but the engineering lead, the CIO, the CTO. They want to kind of see what's happening in the environment. Is our environment running as efficient as it possibly could be running? And when I was going through this section of the benchmark, I noticed that, there's essentially three categories. There's the activity, the company reports, and then the audit. So with activity, you'll see the recent events and all of the events, that could be anything from an incident occurring to severity levels changing on an incident. It's almost like your logs. And when, if you're using xMatters for hosted conference bridges, you can also view and monitor conference calls in the activity section of the report. And so there's several different types of reports in there. When it comes to reports, is this a feature that I'm sure you see like the leadership teams using in organizations and stuff more so than everybody else?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. There's this breadth of reporting, and there's a lot of real-time reporting that people need that are actually resolving problems and issues, and you need status information. And we're probably automatically pushing some of that out at the same time in the workflow. But of course, then we also need essentially, you could think of it in some ways of accountability reporting, but really in the current frame of things, where we're really trying to drive more towards, blameless postmortems. So it's not an indictment on anyone. It's more about continuous improvement. And I think that's where a lot of this reporting really becomes valuable. But of course, as an organization, you have to have the right perspective on it. You can't just be, finger pointing in order to try and look at something. It's really more about looking at our processes. What have we automated, or how are we engaging people, and what was our goal, and how well are we performing against those goals? And maybe our goal was good or bad, but it allows you to actually assess that and then have the visibility so that you can go back and perhaps improve the process. Change your workflow if it's not working well, or change your schedules if they don't really meet what the objective was. And so I think that's really a lot of the value to this is, celebrating the wins, but also looking about where can we improve it. And the postmortem report, down at the incident level is really powerful too, because there's, so many organizations that want to be able to publish, and understand what has happened and how did we respond. Partially because they want to improve, but also partially because they may have audit or regulatory standards that they have to meet, and they have to show that they actually were performing all the right steps. And just making sure that that's as available and as tied to the service or the business as possible is really the goal.
Right. And I love the fact that you brought up blameless postmortem and how the reports can help with that. I am such a firm believer of that. I mean, I've been in environments where it's implemented really well. I've also been in environments where, in the meeting somebody says, "Who are we putting the blame on for this?" So obviously one is much
Yeah.
better than the other, and these reports help a ton with that. I mean, you can actually see what's happening versus just, somebody freaking out and screaming and saying, "Well, what's going on here?" Because that type of energy never actually solves anything. It just, makes people feel better for 5 minutes and then the problem is still there. So to have the ability to put the energy and the time into something that's efficient versus something that's not, this, obviously helps there a ton and can help a ton of organizations. So in terms of on-call management and stuff, I feel like we kind of already touched on this. Is there anything specific that you wanted to talk about here, Paul? I feel like we've been walking through this a ton, but I'd love to dive into anything deeper if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think we have touched on a lot of the great detail. There's, always more that we can get into. I think we could spend hours,
Yeah.
on these topics. So I'll resist, diving into more detail. Just say that it's really flexible.
There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah, I feel like this topic is something where if we didn't watch ourselves, we'd be here until 6 p.m. So
yeah,
it's definitely it's
for
definitely
sure.
something that you could type into or get into for sure. So one of the things I thought this was really cool, the way that the workflows actually look. So this is like a different view on what workflows look like in xMatters, but this is 99% there. This just looks a little bit cleaner than my screenshot that I took with Snagit. Thank you to our graphics team for cleaning this up. But the the way this looks, this is literally how a workflow looks and how it's set up. And this is actually from a real workflow. So when I was going through my testing, I set up this workflow in Azure Alerts, and this was kind of the workflow that was set up. And you could see that it starts with the signal, it starts with the alert, it goes to create an alert, and then at the end, it initiates that incident. And then after that, you can kind of go through and add the trigger of like what you want to do, like what do you want to do if this alert occurs. And this is, I would say, from a low code, no code standpoint, definitely a super clean UI from a workflow perspective. And as you said, Paul, xMatters actually started with the just the coded solution, and now you have a little bit of both. You have the no code, and you have a little bit of code if you want to throw it in there from an automation perspective.
Yeah, I think it is incredibly powerful. And as you said, this is the workflow. Like it's gray instead of a more pleasing blue color. And when you go look at it in the product, but what it shows to me is that just as you described it, it's like I can follow your description right through the path of execution there. And one of the powerful aspects of this is the small black rectangles in there. That's where you can expand this. So this is a workflow that is ready to execute, but it can also be easily adapted and expanded, for more capabilities or change, in any way that you want. And so that becomes a lot of the power of this. And I mean, really, like the technical bits on this are pretty light. I mean, you have to, have Azure call an endpoint, so we want to make sure we have a secure endpoint that we're calling and passing the right details. But once you're there, then this really starts to drive the right communications. It doesn't just forward every signal, necessarily. It ensures that it's truly, one that needs to be addressed right now, and can even be suppressing from a volume perspective to make sure that we don't overwhelm people, or send duplicates out there. So there's a ton of goodness in here that's not obvious at first glance, but I think at first glance, it's already really powerful.
Right. Oh yeah, for sure. Like this is literally a clear representation of what the automated incident response and workflow is going to ultimately look like, and it's literally just all there for you. There's really no thinking or contemplating. Like when I look at this, I'm like, okay, this is exactly what's happening, and I can not only articulate it, but I can also understand what's happening from an engineering standpoint, which is great. So the last bit here, I'm sorry, Paul, did you have something there that you wanted to add?
No, I think you're right on.
Cool. Beautiful. Okay, cool. So the last bit here before we get to the conclusion is one of the things that I really love doing in benchmarks is I like to set up as close to a real world scenario as I possibly can. And this is like, my R&D that I call it, my R&D test here. So what I did was I set up a scenario which was in Azure. I was running an application that was deployed on Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, and then I set up the integrations for messaging. Now, one of the things that I definitely want to point out here is number one, if we go back here, this was the workflow that I set up for this R&D test. So let's say, I had a worker node that went down. Let's say I had 3 worker nodes. I had an alert set up that said, okay, I'm supposed to have 3. And then let's say, I only have 2 worker nodes. Well, at this point, I can have my workflow in xMatters kick off and say, hey, you're supposed to have 3, you only have 2. We're going to go ahead and we're going to, spin up another one, connect it to AKS, or, set up that auto scaling group, however we're going to do it. So again, going back to like what we've kind of been talking about, this automated incident response, if I have an AKS cluster set up and it's supposed to have 3 worker nodes, and then 1 dies for whatever reason, and then what do you kind of have to do at that point? Well, in an older scenario, somebody would have to wake up and spin up another node and get the cube config configured on the extra worker node and this, that, the next thing, yada, yada. Now you really don't have to do that. It's, xMatters looks, it sees the incident is triggered. The incident says it's supposed to have 3 worker nodes. I only have 2. And then xMatters pretty much takes it from there.
Yeah, that becomes really powerful to ensure you've got that environment executing optimally. And even another offshoot of that that one of our clients told us about was that they had an environment that was auto scaled really well, and the challenge that they had was that it would scale up, but it never scaled back down. Like another potential situation where you want to take action and it's important, but maybe it's not urgent. And
Sure.
Being able to automate that so that you come back to the right execution platform can be really powerful, because in the end, that's going to save you a lot of money.
Yep. So true, 100%. And one huge bit that I wanted to put here was like for the test, right? So with the test, one of the things that was really cool to me that stuck out was the fact that as long as, if you want to call it a service or a platform, as long as there's some API that you can hit, you essentially can set up a webhook, have that webhook connect to wherever. So in this case, it was Azure. It connected to Azure Monitor, and that Azure Monitor connected to xMatters. And then at that point, in Azure Alerts, I had to set up the action group and all of that stuff. But once you set up Azure Alerts, you'll then have the ability to configure that webhook, which is literally a simple copy and paste from the URL in xMatters that xMatters gives you to the Azure Monitor. And again, this is all configured. Like once you're setting up the workflow itself, like not only do you have, again, like we talked about before, the documentation that literally tells you the step-by-step right there for you, but it also gives you like the webhook, it gives you the URL, it gives you exactly what you need to connect to wherever you're going. So as long as that API is available, you could pretty much connect to anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the foundation of all these. And some people start to overthink it, but it's as simple as what you've described. And the type of environment that you're setting up here is that common first step for everyone. It's like
Sure.
You've got environments and you've got communication platforms that you need to leverage.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So it's exactly like you said, people think about it in a way that it's super complex. And maybe it used to be, but with something like xMatters, where you literally have a webhook and you copy the URL and you throw it into another service and pretty much that's it. It makes things very much more straightforward to set up something like this, because originally, I'm sure people didn't want to set up something like this because it was very complicated, but now it's not complicated.
Because you're right. It used to be private APIs with
Yeah,
questionable content, but now secure web services with JSON content, like it's
right.
the standard. It's easy to understand and you can figure it out.
Exactly. No, 100%. It's as simple as literally copy and pasting a URL, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's my best.
Right.
My best coding is that copy paste.
Yeah, if it's on Stack Overflow, I'm a great developer.
Yeah.
So, all right, the conclusion here was, something that I thought about, and I wanted to put this into one sentence. And again, this, I steal this from the Google SRE handbook, and this is again something that we were talking about yesterday, which automated response or automated incident response, runbooks gives DevOps engineers and SREs the ability to focus on providing value from an engineering perspective versus spending over 50% of their time putting out fires. And I think this is huge. I've been in positions before where 90% of my time was putting out fires, and you're providing value, but at the same time you could be providing so much more value elsewhere and actually fixing these problems that are occurring. And I definitely believe that's what xMatters can do for us as SREs.
Yeah, I'm in 100% agreement with you. There's so much to DevOps and the SRE, models and things that we often forget that continuous improvement loop that should be part of that. And I think that's what this fundamentally leans into, to say, in the incident response part of this, let's also, make sure that we're improving what we're doing every time, not just protecting the business because we fix problems or incidents faster, but make sure that we're taking those, fundamental ideas from DevOps, the calms model, as it were, that not only we're using automation, but we're sharing it and making sure that it becomes part of the culture. And those are the harder things to do, like picking up an automation tool is fast and easy. Making
Yep.
sure that we use it well as a team and we're sharing things well is a greater challenge.
Totally agree with you 100%. Nine times out of 10, the technology isn't solving it. It's the actual communication, collaboration, and participation. All right, cool, everybody. Well, that's going to bring us to the end. I actually hit the nail on the head there with the timing. Wow, I'm surprised. So I want to go ahead and I want to open it up for any questions now. Any question that you have, it could literally be anything, in the scope of this, whether it's setting up xMatters, whether it's, when to implement something like xMatters, whether it's, even something from an SRE and DevOps standpoint. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. I do have the chat window open here, so I'm more than open here. And while we're actually waiting for this, I'll wait for some questions to come in, but I do just want to put up this last slide here. So, if your organization, anybody would like to contact GigaOm, this is absolutely the way that you can do it right here. Well,
Yeah,
while
no.
we're waiting, did you have any questions from a testing perspective? Oh, I'm sorry, you were just about to say something.
Yeah, actually, I was going to add to this particular slide, about GigaOm. What I really appreciate about you all is the fact that you're not just analysts in an ivory tower sort of version of it. It's like you actually have to live, from a practical experience level, every day with technology and really implementing things. And so your perspective is, much more valuable, I think, than just, non-practitioners that just try to evaluate things. So, so if folks are looking for insights, or looking to partner with an organization like GigaOm, I'd say you guys are a great asset for them.
Definitely appreciate that, Paul. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's, one of the things that we certainly thrive for, and the teams that we're building here from a benchmark perspective are the practitioners. Like for me, for example, like I said in the beginning of the call, I'm still practicing engineering. I'm still writing production level code almost daily. I'm still implementing solutions for customers pretty much daily. So for me, to dive into something like this, I definitely enjoy giving the perspective of actually being hands-on with it, and not just going from a theory perspective, which is obviously really great. And then in terms of giving credit where credit is due, going through this benchmark and working with xMatters and stuff has definitely been a very extremely solid experience. One of the things that stick out for me, and I probably hinted on this throughout the entire webinar here, but one of the things that stick out to me is automated runbooks and automated incident response, and which are workflows and xMatters. I love it. I absolutely love it. I think xMatters is bringing something new and different to the table, and bringing it to the table in an easy to understand way. And it's super crucial. And it was a great experience throughout the benchmark.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I think we've been a well-kept secret for a while, so appreciate you helping us get the word out a little bit more here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and end it here. We're at the top of the hour. Johnny, I think we're all set here to go ahead and take ourselves off live. I'd like to thank everybody so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. Paul, I thank you so much for joining. Really enjoyed the conversation. I love talking about this stuff, obviously. So thank you so much. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I have as well.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again next time for another GigaOm webinar.